and I'll chop off the first part.
No problem. Alright, well, thank you all for coming back for more Illustrator. One of the things that we did last week was talk about why you use Illustrator and what the components are, so sort of how to create your own files in Illustrator. And what I wanted to cover today was working with Illustrator files. And so the difference is that if you already have a file created or you've created your own file in Illustrator, this will give you some tips and tricks on how to work with the paths that you have and the shapes and objects that you've made. So I know that I think everyone in here was at last week's or has been in another Illustrator workshop. So you probably have some idea what the differences are between Illustrator and Photoshop. The fact that we're working with a vector-based software is very significant because it gives you not only a different control of your material, which is working with these paths, the series of anchor points that you can make into lines or to shapes and change the stroke and the fill, but also gives you some flexibility in scale. And because you're working with these objects that are in the vector software, you have also more control over how you move the objects, how you align the objects, how you can adjust a number of the objects at the same time. So I wanted to run through a couple of those steps today. And I brought in a test file so that you can see what a created file might look like. This is a little bit of everything because I wanted to give you some idea of all the possibilities. And so in particular, you can see there's an advantage to working with repeated objects. I have a couple that are similar shapes. I'm working with objects that have similar stroke colors applied as well as fill. When you're working in Illustrator, the two most basic tools to make sure you have a good handle on are working with the selection tool and the direct selection tool. And I mentioned these briefly last week in drawing your own objects, but they're also very powerful tools when working with objects that are already created. The tool on the left, and remember you can always hover over the tools in any of the Adobe software to see what they are, is the selection tool. It is the black arrow, and what this allows you to do is to select an entire object or a path. So if you have the selection tool, if you hover over an object, you'll see a small black dot appears next to the arrow. And this lets you know that you are on an object that you have some control over. When you click on the object itself, the bounding box becomes active. The bounding box is a rectangle that defines the parameters of your object. It will have 8 of these adjustable points. So you can see that there are 3 at the top, 3 at the bottom, and 2 on either side for this object. Once your object is selected with the selection tool, you have the ability to resize it, to reshape it, to rotate it. And you can see now that the object is selected, you lose the tail of your arrow as you hover over the object. So when you are tailless, you can just click and drag your entire object, or you can, if you hover over these points on your bounding box, you can click and drag the dimensions of the object itself. So this allows you to think of the object as sort of a malleable form that you can move around using these tools. One other thing you might notice if you're in the selection tool, you can see in this bottom left-hand corner of the triangle that you get a double-headed curved arrow. That allows you to also rotate this object. So rather than, if you're in Photoshop, you have to go up and make a selection and then choose the rotation. And here you can just click and drag, and it allows you to move the entire object on the center point. So these are very quick ways to move an entire object. Because you're working with objects, anytime you click a new one, it will select everything that's associated with that object. So no matter where I click, you have this independent movement. The other arrow just to the right of it is the direct selection tool. The direct selection tool is different in that it directly selects the points on your path, so your object or your line. So if I go back to the same triangle, when I click on it, you see that I have the white arrow. I can select any of these anchor points. Remember, the anchor points are your points on your path, and click and drag and just move that point independently. So if you are working with an object that you don't want to resize or adjust as a whole, you can actually pick these points, If I click on one of these apostrophe-shaped objects, you have to click once on your object and click again on the point you want to move. You will see that you can pull these points, and each of these points has a pair of handles that come out in opposite directions. And you can see by just observing how I'm pulling this form, if you click and drag on the handles, it changes the curve of your line. So this is a really nice way to smooth out your curves, to change the direction. And if you're freehand drawing with Illustrator, if you're using the paintbrush tool or the pen tool, you'll see that sometimes it's not as accurate as you wanted it to be, especially if you're working with a mouse instead of a drawing tablet. This is a way to go back with your direct selection tool, click and drag your object to get what you intended in the first place. I tend to do a lot of tweaking myself with some of these handles when working in Illustrator. The Illustrator direct selection tool also allows you to select more than one point at a time. We talked about in some other programs too. If you hold down the Shift key, it allows you to continue to add to your selection. So I'm holding down the Shift key, which you can't see. I'm going to click on this anchor point, and then I'm going to click on this next anchor point. And when I drag it, it's actually moving both of those. So this is a way too that you don't just have to rely on the entire object or one point to move. You can select multiple points at a time. Any questions about any of that? Sort of your most basic editing tools in Illustrator. There are a number of also sort of quick tools built into Illustrator that try to anticipate what you want it to do. So besides just modifying your lines, you can select multiple objects at a time without holding down the Shift key. A couple of them that I pointed out on your sheet are the Select Similar Objects button and then the Magic Wand tool. So I wanted to give you a quick demo on how that works. If you're selecting entire objects, you do want to go back to your selection tool, the black arrow on the top left. Click on an object. Just like in the other Adobe programs, this top menu bar will adjust to whatever tool you're using. I've selected an object, so it gives me the option of select similar objects, and it's more or less two squares on top of each other. If I click on that, you can see it selected these four, and I tried something else out on here. So I'm going to select one object. I'm going to change my direct selection tool to all. There's a drop-down menu next to the select similar objects, which you can choose to find similar fills, similar strokes, similar shapes, different opacity if you want everything that you've made 50% opaque on your screen. So you would then select your object. The default on your computer when you open it up will be all. So it looks for all of the similar characteristics. So if I click Select Similar Objects, it selects all of my geometric shapes at the top. So a really fast way to select objects. If you did want to do something like color, if I want to select all of the leaves and all of the bushes, I can click on one of the green, these are leaves, scribbly leaves, and then the stroke color. And if I click on that, you can see it selects all of the green that is that same weight on the screen. So that is, of course, useful if you want to change the color. We talked a little bit last week about your control over the color. So that's something that you can do to do a quick change. The other thing you can do with the select object is you can select multiple objects. You can see these window forms are all different colors. So if I were to use the stroke color, it's only going to find the two similar objects. But if you hold down Shift, you can start adding multiple objects. So just like you're adding points, the Shift button is also a good tool to use to select more than one. If you have a much more complex image, which you probably will at some point get beyond the stage of making shapes, you can use a tool called the Magic Wand tool. It looks like a magic wand in the upper left of the toolbar. If you click on the Magic Wand tool, it will look for color and pattern only. So this is not a tool you can use to find similar line weights or similar shapes. But if I am, looking for all the green in this color of green, I can click on the first one. It will select, see the little blue. It's a little hard to see up here, but the blue points on these. And again, you can hold down Shift and add the blue color to it, and it will select all of your objects. And again, this is really useful if you are trying to change your image. If you're working on logos or something that has, repeated colors, you can try out different colors, by the time you get to that point. The other thing that I wanted to point out, in addition to selecting the objects, is how you can create more of them and line them up together. So if you're working with a series of objects, for example, you can see I've put a series of 6. I'm going to actually add another one. So with your selection tool, said you for your basic tools, you can actually do a Command-C, Command-V, that copy and paste function, which is probably familiar to you if you've used it in Word or other programs. It also works in Illustrator, so it's a quick way to copy and paste another object. So you don't have to redraw all these objects. If you're trying to make something like a fence and you need a 15 post, you can make one, you can perfect it, you can pick the colors, then you can just duplicate it. As you can see, when you duplicate an object, it just drops it right on top of everything else. There are a number of ways, though, to align these, and so this is on the back side of your page. When you are working on objects, the align is one that, depending on the computer you're using, won't necessarily come up in your top menu. We noticed this in the Cornerstone classrooms. The large computer screens allow you to see all of the tools available. If you're working on a laptop or a smaller screen, you might need to open the Align tool. So I made a note on your sheet that under Window, and this is where all of your accessory windows are buried, you can click on Align, and that will bring up a small window that you can use to go through the next steps. So typically when you align objects, the default is for it to they align to themselves. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick selection of all of these objects in the middle. Under Align, you can see Align to Selection is the default. And this is the little image that's on your sheet. What that means is if you go to your Align menu and you select Vertical Align Bottom and click on it, it'll align to the furthest one to the bottom. Super quick way to align your objects. You can align them to the top. You can choose what is the point. You also have the option of aligning to a key object. So let's say you're making your fence and you've dropped 15 fence posts and they're all over the screen, but you know you want them to be right in front of the sidewalk. So you can grab one of your objects using your selection tool. I don't have a lot of room to work here, but say I want them all lined up with this first green point. I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to click and drag to select my objects. You can use any of these selection methods. And then click once again on your key object. You'll get the second border around the object. You can see the orange stroke turns to blue, showing you that's the key object. And if you're ever unsure, the Align box will change to Align to Key Object. So a tiny key shows up in that window. And then if I align them to the bottom, it'll align to the bottom of that object rather than the lowest object in your series. So that's another really easy way to align similar objects, or they can be dissimilar objects if you like. You can also redistribute your objects. They don't only move from top to bottom. There's another area on the Align tool that allows you to distribute them in a number of ways. If I do a horizontal distribute center, that will move them along this horizontal line. Whoops. No. The undo also works in Illustrator, the Command Z. It's always, good to check. What did I make? Horizontal distribute center. Nope. Didn't I just click that? Yeah. Okay, well, so we can always try things again. Trial and error, save copies. You saw it's very slight, but it will align them to the center. So if I do this again, you can see it'll go ahead and even out your objects, the space in between. So it's another quick way, especially if you're working on something that's very design oriented, like a poster maybe. You want everything to be distributed in a particular way. This is a quick way to do that as well. The other thing you can do is actually just align specific points from your objects, which is something that is kind of neat. So for example, if I want all of the top points to match, I can actually do that. You do have to go back to your direct selection tool. This is important because you're only working with individual points on your path rather than the entire object. So I'm going to just click the top points. I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to click on these anchor points in the center. You can always hover above your object if you're unsure where the points are. And then I'm going to give it a shot, vertical align top, and it'll pull that top point up. So if your shapes are the same size, it works also to give you the visual balance, but it's a quick way to like make a bunch of lines and then stretch them all out so they're the same, rather than having to measure, copy, and line up each one. So the last couple of things I wanted to point out were, in addition to arranging objects in a horizontal or vertical plane, how you can also arrange them from front to back. If you've worked in Photoshop before, you might know that layering is a common way to organize your images. So when you keep adding new images to Photoshop, you have a background, layer 1, layer 2. The same thing's actually happening in Illustrator. So whether or not you've noticed, when I move my objects, there is a front and back. So you can tell I've made them from left to right in this document. If you want to rearrange your objects, you can move them forward and backward. The easiest way to do that is to use a right click or a control click to pull up this right click menu. And then you can arrange your objects. The difference between sending back and sending backward is that sending backward will jump you one step at a time. You send it to the back, it pushes it all the way to the back. So if you're unsure where it falls, you can always send it all the way to the back and then start moving it forward again, or you can just move it back slowly one at a time. But you actually can work in layers in Illustrator if you're working on a very complicated project. There is a layer menu. It looks like these two squares of paper stacked on each other on the right hand side. And you can create layers for different groups of objects, different paths that you can then turn the visibility on and off, or you can change the opacity of the entire layer, for example. So if you know that you're going to be working in layers, at any time you can go to this layer menu and make your own. And the last thing I wanted to show you as far as working with your Illustrator files is how to group your objects together. One of the things that you'll find when you start working on objects and paths that have more detail is that it's very easy to click on something and then click on the wrong thing and start changing what you have. If I know that I want this tree and these leaves and these bushes to stay together as a group, you can actually group them so that when you move them and resize them, you don't lose some of these leaves. For example, if I did like a quick click and drag and then move the tree, you can see that I've forgotten one of the leaves. So one way to avoid that is to select your object, and then I think I'm going to use this color tool. I'm going to hold down Shift and add the brown to the orange. If you right click, there's an option for group. And what that does is if I click on one of them, it's going to give me the entire set of objects so that I can resize them, I can rotate them, I can change the order, for example, rather than having to click on each leaf and sending it to the back. I can go ahead and group them and then send them all together as a group. You can always ungroup objects, which is what's really nice about Illustrator, is that basically a built-in undo feature. So anytime that you're done, you can right click and then the group will change to ungroup in your menu. If you want to work on individual parts of this grouped object, you can do so without actually ungrouping, which is really nice. It's in a feature called isolation mode. And if you, for example, double click on your object, you can see that It has actually grayed out the rest of my image, so what used to be apostrophes, kind of blobs, have now become unworkable unless I double click to get out. So what this allows you to do in isolation mode is it allows you to work with pieces of your grouped object without having to physically ungroup everything and then regroup it when you're done making changes. If I just wanted to change, a couple of the colors to orange, and then I double click to get out of isolation mode, this is still a completely grouped object that I can continue to work with. So this is a way to kind of control your focus when working on your objects also. So that's what I have for the basic tools in Illustrator. If you have any questions, you can let me know. I also brought in one other sort of bonus that's not on your handout if you're interested, which is to live trace an image. Yes? Okay, so you'll have to take notes if you want it to remember. There's only 3 stages. It's really not too bad. So what it is to live trace an image is to take a hand-drawn image, something that either, it doesn't have to be hand-drawn, I guess, any object or image that's not a vector file, and turn it into an Illustrator file. So, for example, if you do a lot of hand drawings and you want to color them for a coloring book or something, sort of in Illustrator, then you can make the drawings by hand. Let's say you aren't very adept at drawing in Illustrator. Scan it in, turn it into a vector file, and then work with it in Illustrator. So I brought in a sample file. The first step is to make a file in Illustrator. I'm just going to pick a blank screen. You do have to have a file already created. And when you scan in a file to your computer, it's not going to scan as an Illustrator document. So open an Illustrator, make a new document, and then you go under File and you place your image. So what this does is basically pasting an image into your document. I drew a slide since it was by my desk. It'll be stuck to your cursor, so this helps you if you want to place it in a particular place. And then at this point, you can click and drag. It's got its own bounding boxes. But you can see when I'm selecting it with the selection tool, you don't see individual points on this object. It's just the image itself. So you hit return, or just click away from it, and you can still leave this in your file. If you want to modify your image in any way, if you want to change the color, if you want to change the scale, if you want to integrate it into what you already have, you can do what's called a live trace. The function for live trace is under Window. In this case, Image Trace. If I click Image Trace, you must have your object selected. It's a good reminder. You can have it just trace the image, which will try to find its points. Because this is a black and white image, I'm going to go ahead and you can see in the preset menu, there's an option for black and white logo. I want it to be as clean as possible, so I might click that, and you can see it gives me a very high contrast image. There are other options you can use. Some work better than others. If I hit silhouette, for example, I get a much darker image. The colors aren't going to give me too much since I don't have any color in my object. Shades of gray will give me a little bit more of that nuance between the light strokes of marker and the darker strokes. You can turn preview on and off in this window, so if you're not seeing those results as you work, you can make sure that's checked. And then that's it. You basically just click out of your image trace window. You can see I still have an image without the points on the path. What I've done is basically simplify this image so that it can be better understood. If you have your object selected, you can go under Object, and then there's an Image Trace function. And what you want to do is expand the image. So what this does is it opens it up and adds those points. Yes. And if you zoom in, you can see it has made this a little bit more of a logo. If I click on it, the points it's added are on the outside of my lines. So all of these now become active points that you can move. If I just, there we go. So you can see, you can change the width of your lines. The other thing that I suggest is to clean up your object after you do the image trace, because you get sort of an exorbitant amount of points. So I'm using my selection tool to select the entire image. Then you go under Object. Where is it? There's a cleanup function. Can't tell if it's grayed out or I'm missing it. If I'm in the wrong. Yes. Yes, I'm going to definitely do that. Okay, path. There it is. This is a good demo on how to use the help box too. So it's object path cleanup. And it will look for everything you don't need. No cleanup was necessary. If you have a line drawing, it will clean up quite a bit. Because it's reading it as an object, I think it needs those extra points on the path in order to keep the little bit of curves that I have. But you can go through and do the object path cleanup or simplify. Let's see. Which will give you something very artistic. I said, depending on what you're working on, what kind of image you have, you'll get different results with different tools. So these are options you can go through and trying to clean up your object. So that is the last thing I have for you today then on Illustrator. So if you have any questions though, then let me know. Yes?
If you have a line drawing that you have done the live trace and you have all the lines on the outside, you try to make a really thin little line. Is there a way to make it one line?
I think you could try to simplify it. We can look at your file though together and see if we can figure it out. Because you can actually, when you apply live trace, you can even apply it to a photograph and it will simplify your lines, and you can keep simplifying and simplifying. There are also ways you can remove points on the path manually or in sections. Like you have a line drawing, you can basically select a section and then simplify it, and you can give it some clues on how many points, like your tolerance is for the distance.
Change the number,
yeah.
And then.
But as far as this, like the same thing probably is happening to what's happening on my drawing, that it recognizes a fill. Might be worth changing it into like a black and white logo or something that will even simplify it further. Maybe one of those filters in the live trace.
So with the photograph, what's the next step?
So with the photograph, the next steps, you do have to simplify the colors. And so...
Well, so we have a black and white photograph.
Okay.
And we want to...
So you want to do the...
Trace the outline of the form.
What I would actually recommend first is opening it in Photoshop and trying to simplify it as much as possible by blowing out the contrast a little bit. Otherwise, in Illustrator, you'd have to trace the image. So you could place your photograph on, and then you could pull out one of the drawing tools, like the paintbrush or the pen tool. Paintbrush is probably a little bit more accurate for that. And then make a new layer, although it's optional at this point because you could still select and delete your photo, and then start drawing on top of your photo. And then when you're satisfied with it, you could delete the photo or hide the photo, and then print it off as the line drawing. That's how I would do it. You have to draw it though. But you could try also to take just a black and white photograph, you could try to go through the live trace and also try the poster function or one of the like 3-color grayscale that might give you a little bit more of a cutout type pattern to get rid of some of the extra detail. Anyone else? All right, thanks. Yeah.
That last function was worth the whole half hour.
So that is the one that we'll do this in digital art this week. A little bit more of that. I don't know how to stop it.
And if you need a little wake-up juice, I have some candy and ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I can't remember, but I think the digital art workshop has both the live trace for a photograph, like to simplify it down to a certain number of colors
Yeah.
to make it look like a paint by number.